Steve Jobs, the man who changed the world, from an abandoned baby to Apple's greatest success and biggest failure. Imagine being rejected before you were even born. On February 24, 1955, a baby boy entered the world in San Francisco, California. His biological parents were two young college students who felt they weren't ready to raise a child. So they made one of the hardest decisions of their lives. They gave him up for adoption. That child was Steve Jobs. His adoptive parents, Paul and Clara Jobs, weren't wealthy. Paul worked as a mechanic and loved fixing old cars, while Clara worked as a bookkeeper. They didn't have much money, but they had something more valuable: unconditional love. Paul spent countless weekends teaching young Steve how to take apart engines, repair electronics, and understand how things worked. More importantly, he taught him a lesson that Steve would never forget. If you're building something, even the parts nobody will ever see should be made perfectly. Years later, that philosophy would define every Apple product. As a child, Steve was brilliant but difficult. He often became bored in school, challenged his teachers, and preferred spending hours experimenting with electronics instead of doing homework. He wasn't interested in fitting in. He wanted to understand the world in his own way. During his teenage years, Steve met someone who would completely change his life. His name was Steve Wozniak. While Jobs was the dreamer, Wozniak was the engineering genius. Woz could build almost anything with electronic circuits. Jobs, however, could see something even bigger. He knew that technology wasn't just about machines, it was about changing people's lives. The two Steves quickly became close friends. One of their first businesses was selling blue boxes, small electronic devices that allowed people to make long-distance phone calls for free. It wasn't exactly legal, but it taught Jobs an unforgettable lesson. Technology could give ordinary people incredible power. In 1972, Steve enrolled at Reed College in Oregon. But after just 6 months, he dropped out. Most people thought he had ruined his future. Without officially attending classes, he slept on friends' floors, collected empty Coke bottles for money, and walked miles every Sunday just to get a free meal at a nearby temple. Life was difficult. Yet dropping out allowed him to attend classes that actually interested him. One of them was calligraphy. At first glance, beautiful handwriting seemed completely useless for someone interested in computers. But years later, when Apple designed the Macintosh, Steve remembered those lessons. That's why Macs became the first personal computers with multiple fonts and beautiful typography. A random class changed the future of computing. Sometimes, the things that seem meaningless today become priceless tomorrow. After college, Steve searched for purpose. He even traveled to India, hoping to find spiritual enlightenment. He returned with a shaved head, simple clothing, and a different perspective on life. He believed simplicity was powerful. That belief would later become Apple's design philosophy. In 1976, at just 21 years old, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak started a small company in the Jobs family's garage. Its name? Apple Computer. The garage wasn't filled with expensive machines or a large team. It was just a few determined people assembling computer boards by hand. To raise money, Jobs sold his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sold his prized calculator. They were risking almost everything. Their first product, the Apple I, wasn't revolutionary, but it proved they could build and sell computers. Then came the Apple II. Unlike other computers that required technical knowledge, the Apple II was colorful, user-friendly, and ready for everyday people. It became one of the biggest success stories of the personal computer revolution. Almost overnight, Apple exploded. Investors rushed in. Sales skyrocketed. By the age of 25, Steve Jobs had become one of the youngest self-made millionaires in America. For most people, that would have been enough. For Steve Jobs, it was only the beginning. Success made him even more ambitious. He dreamed of creating a computer so simple and beautiful that anyone could use it. To achieve this dream, Apple hired John Sculley, a successful executive from Pepsi. Jobs personally convinced him with a sentence that became legendary. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? Sculley accepted. Together, they began working on what Steve believed would change computing forever: the Macintosh. Inside Apple, Steve demanded perfection. Employees worked day and night. Designs were rejected repeatedly. He expected impossible standards and wasn't afraid to criticize anyone who failed to meet them. Some employees admired him. Others feared him. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. Steve Jobs refused to accept good enough. In January 1984, Apple introduced the Macintosh with one of the most famous advertisements ever created. Millions watched as Apple presented the computer that promised to challenge the technology giants of the time. The Macintosh changed history. It introduced the graphical user interface, icons, windows, and a mouse to millions of people. But despite its innovation, sales didn't meet Apple's expectations. Behind closed doors, tensions between Steve Jobs and John Sculley grew worse every day. Arguments became louder. Trust disappeared. The company's board had to choose between its passionate founder and its experienced CEO. The decision shocked the world. In 1985, at just 30 years old, Steve Jobs was fired. The company he had built in his parents' garage no longer wanted him. Imagine creating your dream from nothing, only to be thrown out of it. For Steve Jobs, it was the most painful moment of his life. But what nobody knew was that this devastating failure was only the beginning of the greatest comeback in business history.